In this program, we're going to be thinking about difficult conversations. The kinds of conversations that we sometimes have to have at work. And occasionally they're called courageous conversations. Sometimes they're called difficult conversations. But the reality is that when you work with people, any shape or form, you're going to have conversations where you perhaps disagree, or you don't like the outcome, or perhaps you want to challenge something that's happened. Sometimes it's behaviours, sometimes it's not getting something in on time, sometimes it's quality of work. And I don't know whether you are a manager or supervisor or a leader and you're thinking about how can I have these conversations in a way that's respectful but also going to get the job done. I don't know whether perhaps you're thinking in terms of working with your peers and you'd like to have these conversations in a way that works better. Or perhaps you're in a project group and you're sort of thinking, well, it's difficult because we don't have that hierarchy of authority here. How do I call somebody out on their work? In fact, do I call them out on their work? And it's an ongoing space that many people find awkward. And over the last 30 years that I've been working in learning and development, difficult conversations, courageous conversations, call them what you will, conversations, because these are just conversations you have to have. It's one of those things that keeps coming back and keeps getting requested. Clearly, many of us would like to be better at it. So let's dig into how we can do this and some of the areas that we might want to be a bit careful about. And I have some questions for you to consider to start with. So what is it that you are finding difficult when it comes to this particular topic? So, for example, are there certain subjects that you would avoid talking about? That's because you find them embarrassing. Or it might be because you're not sure if it's your place to say anything. Or perhaps you are not too clear about what you can and can't raise in the workspace. Or it could be there are individuals where you work that you will avoid. For many reasons, I'm sure good reasons. Most of us, if the business is large enough, there's at least one person where we are so diametrically opposed. I'm not saying they're wrong or you're wrong. It's just our outlooks on life are so different that maybe there's somebody in the team or the project group that you struggle to have that level of connection with. So when it's a difficult conversation, it feels even worse. Maybe you avoid them. Or perhaps there are some reactions that some people have when things go a bit awkward in difficult conversations that you don't like. Certain emotions. Maybe you're okay with, I don't know, somebody being a bit angry with you because you think, oh, I understand that. But if they go silent, maybe you find that really difficult. But the question I've got for you really, whether or not you are in charge or you're running a bit of the project, or whether you're thinking in terms of peer to peer, what is the effect of putting off these conversations? Because I will share with you. This sounds a little bit like a joke, but it's all too true. Many people, when they've got a conversation they don't want to have, they will put it off and put it off and put it off in the desperate hope that somehow it resolves itself. So I noticed, for example, that many times supervisors won't raise somebody's late coming if it's only 3, 4, 5 minutes, even if it's a pattern every single day. And they don't mention it in the hope that somehow it will fix itself, which, by the way, it almost certainly never does. And if ignoring the problem doesn't happen, then the next stage that people sometimes move on to is making gently sarcastic, jokey comments. So we've all seen that, haven't we, at a meeting when somebody arrives a few minutes late and the person at the front of the room who's leading the meeting will say, oh, good of you to join us. Good afternoon. Seat for you down the front here so you don't miss anything. Now, that gentle sarcasm, that gentle humour is intended, of course, to hope the person nudges along and goes, oh my goodness, I realise I shouldn't have done that. Which, again, they rarely do. The third stage, of course, is to go to HR and complain and ask them to do it for you. So I might ask you to consider, when I say it out loud like that, it clearly is pretty ineffectual. So why is it that we put these conversations off? Well, it's because it's awkward, it's embarrassing, we don't want to upset anybody. You're probably trying to do your best to stay and in the processes and do everything correct. So the worry or the concern about somebody shouting and raising their voice or becoming sarcastic or upset is really quite awful, which is why many of us will put the conversation off. But think about when you do that, because If you're in charge, other people are judging everything you do and everything you don't do. And if you don't deal with somebody who's not performing at the correct level, if you don't call out when somebody is late or rude or inappropriate, if you fail to challenge standards, to raise them to the correct standard, that is going to really undercut your authority, because other people in the room know that you let that individual off because, well, they shout a bit, they get sarcastic, they get upset. And that undercutting of your authority, of course, is not going to help you. It's also, let's be honest, really unfair, because none of us like it if we feel that one person is getting special treatment over us. So there really is nothing to be gained from putting off the conversation and not having the conversation. And by the way, the more that you don't call out unacceptable behaviours, the more they become acceptable, at least in the mind of the individual, and then gradually, by osmosis, through everybody else. If one person keeps turning up a couple of 3 minutes late, then it either becomes 4 minutes or 5 minutes or 6 minutes. Once one person sees that, well, somebody else will try it and somebody else will try it. And before you know where you are, you've got a major issue. You can't put these conversations off. And in terms of responsibility, that's an interesting one, isn't it? That will in part depend upon who you are. My suggestion is going to be this: in a project group, in a team, if you're fairly close-knit, if you're all at the same level, you need to have an open and frank conversation where you agree that because you have time-sensitive work to get done, because you are on a similar level, that you're going to agree to call out behaviours in a respectful way and deal with them at source so they don't get worse. Of course, if you're the supervisor or the manager, if you have any nominal charge over the group, then my suggestion might be that this responsibility lies with you. It does not lie with HR. HR's job is on a bigger level to ensure that the people part of the business and the organisation is doing what it needs to do. It's not there to do the conversations you don't want to do. Now, if we think about this in a little bit more depth, we might think about some of the reactions that we don't like. We might think about some of the topics we don't like. And both of those could be cause for conversations being difficult. But the third reason, if you want to think about fault, might be it's your fault. It might be that you need to do this better. It might be that perhaps you don't manage difficult conversations very well. Maybe you do those things I just spoke about. You put them off, or you make sarcastic comments, or maybe there are other things you're doing. And frequently, again, this is from speaking to many leaders and supervisors and managers, frequently people are desperately trying to do the right thing, but don't really think through the effect of what it is they want to try out or the way that they deal with anything. So what I might ask you to do is to start to consider you are only really, truly, ultimately responsible for yourself. You can't make other people behave in a certain way. Now, you can call out poor behaviours. You can call out poor work quality or poor timekeeping. Those are things that you can do. They are within your gift. Of course, how the other person chooses to respond to that is their responsibility. And I want you to really keep this idea in mind, because from all the people I've spoken to, a theme that comes through a lot, most of us are decent people trying to do a tough job in difficult situations, sometimes with really awful people. So I'm going to ask you, please, as you want to improve your own ability to have these sorts of conversations, I want you to take responsibility. And I've used the word fault there on purpose, for you to take responsibility for the things that you can control. So my assumption as we go into this program is that you are going to be respectful and polite and timely and appropriate when you're going into these sorts of conversations. And it's the old stuff, isn't it? If you're going to praise somebody, do it where everybody hears. If you need to talk to somebody about a change or an improvement, please, of course, do that discreetly, do that privately. Do it with respect for the other person, knowing that they are likely to feel upset or challenged or threatened. So when we think about whose fault is this, what we've got to consider is that we can absolutely control everything we do. We can have this conversation to the best of our ability. And that really is our cut-off point. So my advice always to people is when you need to start thinking about this, what are the areas that are controllable for you? Let's focus on those, make those as good as we can. And then really it's down to the other person to manage it themselves. If you are of a mind where you think, yes, but it depends how I talk to them, how they respond, there's a partial degree of truth in that. But let's flip that. If I were to be rude to your face, if I were to start shouting at you, now you might feel all sorts of things. You might feel offended, threatened, angry, upset, curious. You could feel all sorts of things. But how you feel and how you behave are two separate sides of this. And this is crucial that we understand this, because when you have to sit down with somebody and tell them something that they do not want to hear, they are entitled to feel internally any way they want. But how they behave is up to them. Just as when you are leading the conversation, how you might feel about the individual is entirely for you to believe, to feel. It's absolutely right, whatever your feeling is. But how you talk to the other person, that is your responsibility. We need to keep that in mind as we go into this. So, what are some of the conversations that we might struggle with? And if we look at this list here, this is a fairly typical list for many workplaces. There's a few there that tend, for many people, to start triggering some thoughts. And I'd ask you to consider for yourself, which of these do you most dislike having to deal with? And if you've never dealt with any of these, which of these would give you most concern for having to say, Bob, do you have a couple of minutes, please? And inviting them into your room. So, when I look at this list, what I'm struck with is how many people gravitate towards the more personal stuff. It's like personal hygiene. That's a classic one, isn't it? Or personal problems. Or banter. Or attitude. And when I ask people, what is it about those that may be worse for you than the other ones? I'd be interested in, if you think about this for yourself, why is lateness, for example, easier than personal problems? And of course the reason is that lateness has a metric. Lateness has a number or a time or a number of occasions. In other words, it's provable. Whereas if we've got to think about attitude, if we've got to think about personal hygiene, we'll come back to that in a moment. If we've got to think about those things, because they're personal, that's often where we start to get upset. Well, I don't want to upset the person. I don't want them to be angry or embarrassed. But the reality is, and think about what we just spoke about, you are responsible for you, they are responsible for them. Unless you are dealing with teenagers or toddlers, as adults at work, we are responsible for ourselves. Ultimately, we're responsible for our families and our loved ones. But in work, we are representing ourselves. And as managers and supervisors, or as colleagues and peers, we can only control our bit of this interaction. So when you sit down with somebody and say, right, listen, we need to talk about, one thing to keep in mind is, what can I link to the wider effect on the workspace? So if I think about banter, for example, so banter is often jokes. It's often used as an excuse, actually. So somebody might be saying something that is a little inappropriate. It might be where jokes move from being genuinely fun and enjoyable, perhaps nudging towards being a little unfair on somebody or making some personal comments. And frequently when people are called out for banter, they say, oh, but I didn't mean anything. It was just banter. We were just joking. It was just fun. And so the problem then is, well, do I need their consent that it was unfair or unreasonable? Well, if you're in charge of this group, you can say, this is the concern I have about it. This is my worry, or this is what I'm not liking seeing at the moment. You might talk about the individual and the way that they've asked that person to stop, for example. If they've asked them to stop, that's it. Game over. Stop the jokes. Whether you intended it as banter or not is not really the point. The point is the reaction it's getting. So I'd ask you to consider an idea, which is the meaning of any communication is the response you get. So if somebody is bantering with somebody else and that somebody else has said, I don't like this anymore, I find it unfair or a bit unpleasant, or I find it akin to bullying, that's it. Let's end that conversation right now. What we don't need to do if we're calling somebody out on their banter is to get caught up on whether there is an actual definition here, whether they agree with us, whether they don't agree with us, whether their intention was good. Their intention could have been good. We can acknowledge that. But we can also quickly acknowledge that where we are right now is not working for the individual or indeed the wider workspace. And you can see that very simple approach will pretty much apply to many of these. So if we don't have the metrics as we would, for example, for lateness, we can absolutely reflect very clearly and simply on the wider effect. So personal hygiene. Why is it that personal hygiene is so difficult? Well, because we don't want to upset anybody, don't want to offend anybody, we don't want anybody to be embarrassed. Now, all of those things are true. And I'm sure you don't want to upset or offend your colleague. And then, of course, there's always a response, yes, but what if? What if they didn't know? What if it was medical? These things are possible. But in most cases, it's just a lack of hygiene, whether that is machine washing clothes, personal hygiene, use of products afterwards. So how do we get into that? Well, the reality is we've just got to tell them, Bob, we need to have a conversation. And I think it might be a little bit awkward, but it is a conversation we need to have. Now, that would work for many of the subjects on the screen. Bob, I've noticed when you're around, there is a smell of body odour. And I'd hate for people to start to notice that rather than your excellent work. I want to make sure that you're okay and that you're able to deal with that. Now, it might be as simple as that. 2 or 3 sentences. Yes, it is a bit like ripping off the bandage, but surely that is better than, and this has been said to me so many times, in seriousness, well, what I do is I open the windows every time the person comes in and starts doing this. That's that example I said earlier on, gently, subtly hoping that they deal with it. So many businesses have said to me, oh, well, what we did was we sellotaped a can of deodorant next to the individual's locker. That's really hurtful if you think about it. That's like having some broccoli stuck in your teeth. You've had a lovely night out with your partner. You were the life and soul of the party. You get back, you go to clean your teeth, there's a big chunk of broccoli there. Why didn't you tell me? You might think. Well, as your partner, you were having such a nice night and didn't want to embarrass you. Surely, that momentary embarrassment is considerably better than everybody talking about it. Which is why I like that phrase. I'd rather us deal with this than everybody. I'd rather us deal with this personal hygiene issue than everyone talking about it. I want us to talk about your excellent work. You'll notice that same strategy would work with something like personal problems. And just on personal problems, what do you do if you say to somebody, what's going on? What's the problem? They go, well, it's personal. Are you allowed to ask? Well, the short guideline is this. You can pretty much ask anything you want to, so long as it pertains directly to work. So it's probably not a smart idea to say, is everything okay at home? You might want to be a bit careful about that. However, if somebody says, I've got some problems at home, well, they've raised it as a topic. It's probably okay in that situation to go, you want to talk about that? It's a little bit like, if somebody says, I didn't get the work done because of personal problems, are you allowed to ask about that? Well, the guideline would be this. If you want me to give you some leeway and allowance because of your personal problems, you need to give me some idea of what those personal problems are. If you don't want to tell me what those personal problems are, that's fine and I entirely understand that. However, I can't automatically give you leeway just because you say it's personal. So let's move the topic forward a little bit. We've thought about some of the topics of conversation. What about some of the reactions we get? And on the screen right now are some very common reactions that people really do not like dealing with. And I'd remind you what I said earlier on. It's worth separating how you feel about something with how you behave towards something. And people will say, yeah, but if you get so angry, you can't help it. I don't accept that. I mean, we've all felt like that on occasions, and there are times, of course, when we flip, We might raise our voice, or we might say something really sarcastic. We might burst into tears. But my suggestion to you right now is this. Everything on the screen, with the possible exception of crying, everything on the screen is your responsibility. In other words, they are choices that you are making. And if you've never thought about it, today's the day to think about it. If I tell you something you do not like, you do not want to hear, that you find offensive or upsetting, but remember what I said, I've taken responsibility for my way of speaking to you. And I have been polite and respectful, but I have been to the point and given you the detail that we need to talk about. You are entitled to feel furious about what I've told you. You're not entitled to be angry at me. You're not entitled to make threats to me. And that would apply right the way through this. Now, there's a possible exception with crying. We'll come back to that in a moment. My question will be for you, how do you deal with these emotional reactions? I think there are three broad ways that we might work with these. So I'll come on to that in just a second. There are, of course, lots of emotional reactions that we might see. But typically, the way you feel versus the way you behave are separate. And I used this phrase earlier on, unless you're a teenager or a toddler, you don't really have an explanation for why you're not behaving in a certain way. Now, of course, there are certain individuals or certain situations who find the link between how they're feeling and how they're behaving are far closer. But these are one-off situations. These are particular situations with particular individuals. And you, of course, will know them and will get to know that particular detail of that individual. That's just what makes them them. The majority of us, we have the ability as an adult to separate how we feel with how we behave. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are largely three guideline responses that you have when things get a little bit emotional. Now, the first one below me right now is empathise. So if I think about crying, for example, if you burst into tears, what's the best way to handle that? As a human to human, I can empathise that you are sufficiently upset to find yourself crying at work. So it's a horrible moment. So I have absolute empathy for how you are feeling in the moment. But we still need to have a conversation. We still need to deal with the topic. We still need to get into the problem that we've got here. So one of the worst things you can do, in my opinion, is the moment somebody starts crying, is to go, oh my goodness, let's have a hug. Please don't hug people at work. Be careful of that. But one of the worst things is, oh my goodness, oh, you're crying, I'll get HR in, let me get you some tissues. Because let's just play this through. Imagine you and I are working together. Now, if I start crying because you've told me my work is not up to speed, it could be something in my personal life. It could be because I'm feeling quite highly strung that day. It could be because I didn't sleep last night. It could be because I'm hungover from last night. It could be because I really thought I'd done some good work and I'm a bit upset to know I haven't. It could be because I'm embarrassed that I didn't do the work well enough for you. It could be a million different reasons. But one thing is true. If I start crying in front of you, I don't really want you to notice. So if we're having a private conversation and I find myself starting to get a little bit like this, one of the best things you can do for me is, the word there is ignore. Now it's a slightly pretend ignore because you know I'm crying. But what you might do is focus on the notes you're taking, which gives me just a few moments breathing space. It allows me just to go, okay, come on, stop. And if I think you haven't noticed that I'm crying, and you pretend that you haven't noticed that I'm crying, then that gives me a little bit of... I feel like I've completely lost my dignity. I feel like I managed to get rid of the tears and then carry on the meeting, get myself back on balance. Now that's going to be a good outcome for us both because we can still have the meeting. Or it might be that actually I am properly crying. You can see I'm starting to cry. Now what I would say at this stage, don't say to the person, do you want to go and nip to the bathroom? Do you want to go and just take a breather? Don't say that. Instead, you stand up and say, I'm going to get you some water. Don't say, would you like some water? Just say, I'm going to get you some water, and then leave. Now, there's a few things that will happen at this stage. One is that in many occasions, they'll go, right, that's it. Come on, stop crying. I don't want to cry in front of my colleague, my boss, my supervisor. they will get control of themselves. When you're out getting their water and you come back, you're able to look around the corner of the door, through the window, however it's set up, and you can see that they are getting a bit of control. When you come back into the room, don't put the drink in front of them. Instead, hold the drink out and say, take a sip. Pretty much everybody will. And a little sip of water, physiologically, makes it very difficult to keep crying. That sounds like a joke, but it's true. So it allows them just to get the grip of that outward emotion. If you send them out to get themselves some water, they may not come back. They leave your office and there's a person outside who goes, oh my goodness, what have they said to you now? Come and talk to me. The whole thing becomes a big performance. So instead you go and get the water. Come back, give them water, take a sip. Now, all of those stages, in many cases, the other person will stop crying. If they don't, all right, you can then choose to end the conversation if you wish. Look, this has clearly come as a shock to you. Let's reschedule this tomorrow morning. Come in at 8:30. Let's get started before the rest of the business gets going. And let's just see if we can work out how we're going to do this. That gives them time to think that through. Now, that would be my last option. I'm going to try and deal with it today. And what's on the screen pretty much applies to those reactions that I was just sharing with you. And of course, there are many other reactions. If I just take sulking and sarcasm as two other examples here. Sometimes people think that if you are being sarcastic, it needs to be called out and challenged. My argument is actually you're better to ignore it. And when I say ignore it, I mean pretend I haven't noticed that you're being sarcastic. If I say to you, how do we solve this problem, Bob? And Bob says, I don't know, Graham. I'll work 24 hours a day, shall I? Now, clearly, Bob's being sarcastic. The problem is, put yourself in that position. I can't prove Bob's being sarcastic, even though I know he is. It's like when you and your partner have a disagreement. You know they're being sarcastic, but they will only admit it when they're ready to. So for me, there are two ways you can do this. One is you could call it out. This is a real HR style, which is to say something like, I don't know if you realise, Bob, but when you said that, you did sound a little bit sarcastic, which I'm sure wasn't your intention. Now, if you're going to do that, you need to be able to do it not sarcastically. That's a nice approach. It's a good technique. My personal preference is to go, if Bob says, I don't know, Graham, I'll work 24 hours a day. So go, all right, 24 hours a day, what else you got? Now, in most cases, Bob's going to go, but I mean, I can't work 24 hours a day. At which point I'm going to ignore, again, the nonsense and just go, all right, great. So what are your solutions? When you follow somebody into sarcasm, you're on their territory. They are controlling the conversation. If you sidestep the sarcasm and keep working towards the solution, they have to come onto your territory. And by the way, the same thing with sulking. If you want to indulge a sulker and go, come on, I know what this is about, you're losing. You're following them onto their territory. And you know how impossible it's. If you're having a sulk with your partner, I know you're way too adult to do that, but if you're having a sulk with your partner, and your partner says, come on, we said we weren't going to do this anymore. You know, don't you? You're the only person who can decide when this is over. Now, it's the same with our colleagues. And just while we're on it, by the way, if somebody is getting to anger, somebody's getting to threats, my personal view is this. And you may have a different cut-off point. You may feel it is worth allowing somebody to rant and rave and shout because it gets it off their chest and then you can calm them down. I would remind you what I said right at the start. They're responsible for them. You're responsible for you. I don't care what I've just told you that you don't like. You do not have the right to shout or threaten me. For me, the moment that starts, it's not even a warning. It's a, we're going to end that conversation right there. We'll pick this up at 3:00. Some people would say, if you're unable to moderate your tone, we're going to end that conversation right there. If you do that, you then have to end it. You can't allow them to keep driving the conversation up or the anger up. And some people think I would rather allow you to rant and rave and get it off your chest. Now, this is one that I think is a personal choice. My perspective is you don't have the right to shout at me any more than I don't have the right to shout at you. We can absolutely disagree, but we are not going to do that disrespectfully. So the 3 strategies on the screen, and you'll notice that you might use 1, 2, or even 3 of those in any single interaction. Now, I spoke to you about the topic, and I spoke to you about some of the emotional reactions. And the other part of this, of course, was how is it that you are running this meeting or this conversation? And on the screen right now are 10 common mistakes made when giving feedback. And this often might well lead to some disagreements in difficult conversations. So what's on the screen are really common mistakes. In fact, these are so common, it's highly likely that 2 or 3 of these not only do you do, but you were actually told at some point in the management program that they're really good practice. Look at number 4, for example. The negative feedback gets sandwiched between positive messages. The sandwich technique is much beloved of people everywhere. Hi, come in, shut the door, sit down. Okay, good stuff, good stuff, good stuff. What are you waiting to hear? But bad stuff, bad stuff, bad stuff. Anyway, all in all, great job. Keep on going. And my problem with that cut several ways. First of all, everybody knows the sandwich technique, so it is well overused. And because it's overused, you are operating at a disadvantage. What I mean by that is the moment I say, come in, shut the door, sit down, what are you waiting for? Probably something you haven't done. And then I say, good stuff, good stuff, good stuff. But all you're waiting to hear is, but. So now you're a bit irritated because you know you're here on a ruse. You're only here because I've got something bad to say to you, but I'm pretending I have good stuff first. So now you're irritated. Then I get to the stuff I really want to say, which is likely to make you go, oh, yeah, I knew it was too good to be true. And now you're extra irritated even before you hear the feedback. And then I finish with, anyway, all in all, but you don't even listen to that because you're still fuming about the earlier bit. So what's the solution? By the way, if you're doing number 4 and you're determined to keep doing number 4, the world will keep on turning. Nothing bad will happen, and you're doing it, of course, with the best of intentions. But let's think it through. I'm going to argue this. I think if we want to have difficult conversations, if we want to negotiate and get on with people better, if we want to have these sorts of conversations, we ought to have the strength of character. If I need to say something to you that you don't want to hear, so some developmental feedback, I need to just be able to tell you. Got a couple of minutes. Here's a thing. Here's another thing. I wonder whether we could do this thing next time. All right, thanks very much. Now, the flip side of that is that I have to be ready to say positive stuff to you as well. Do you have a couple of minutes? Yeah, okay. Here's some good feedback. Here's some good feedback. All right, thanks very much. Now, the question to ask yourself is this. How often do you give pure, unadulterated good feedback? Now, you're probably thinking quite a lot, but then I have a challenge question for you. When did your boss last contact you for the sole reason of giving you positive feedback? If right now you're thinking, who is my boss? We have a wider problem. The difficulty is this. We tend to identify feedback as the bad stuff. We tend to think we can't just give them the bad stuff because that will send them out of the meeting a bit down or a bit depressed. And so therefore we've got to dress it up with some positive stuff. I say that is predictable. And what we ought to be doing is giving positive stuff just because we can, and developmental stuff just because we can. And to say to somebody, listen, that thing you did the other day, it was fantastic. Thank you so much. It really helped me. It takes 10 seconds. So let's get past this ridiculous notion that we don't have time to do it. We could be handing out positive feedback all day long. But you know what? We don't. We tend to only hear that negative stuff, the developmental stuff. That's part of the problem. That's part of why people wrap it up as a sandwich. Ask yourself this question. If when you finish this program, if you glanced at your device, your phone, and there's an email from your boss, you thought, oh God, what do they want? And there was just a couple of lines praising you about something. How good would that feel? If you can't remember the last time that happened, the question you've got to ask yourself is, how good are you at handing out positive feedback? Now, I pick at number 4 just as a random one because it comes up quite often. But when you look at these 10, you can see that all of them have an issue contained within them. These are the most common mistakes. So number 1, the judging the individuals, not the actions. It's very easy to say you're really careless as opposed to you've been really careless. Separating the individual from the behaviour. People often give vague feedback, number 2, because they're attempting to justify why they need to say something that somebody else doesn't like. It's of no value. We want to have feedback that we can deal with, that we can operate on. Speaking for others is also a contentious one, number 3 there, because, of course, sometimes bosses will say to us, go and give this person this feedback on this topic. But the reason it's on this list is because sometimes people will say things like, I need to bring to your attention, Bob. I need to talk to you, Bob. It's been brought to my attention that you've done X, Y, and Z. Bob's question, of course, is, well, who said that? And if your answer is, I can't tell you, it was brought to me in confidence, that's rubbish. So we need to own the feedback we're going to give. Generalities there, number 5, is very similar to the issue in number 2. And this idea at number 6, psychoanalyzing the motives behind behaviour. You can best see this in relationships, in personal relationships. It's what I was talking about with sulking. I know why you're doing this. It's because of what we said earlier on. You still don't like it. You don't know what is going on in anyone else's head. So to call it out as part of feedback, you're always going to be on very, very shaky ground. Feedback gets too long. Say what you need to say, move on. An implied threat often gets challenged as well, number 8 there. So surely we need to say to somebody, if you don't fix this, these things will happen. Yes, we do. That's not an implied threat. An implied threat is when you are vague rather than telling them what you want them to do and why. So if you've ever heard somebody say, or you've ever said, if you don't fix this, we'll have to take it further. What does that mean? It would be so much better to go, if you fix this, we will be here and this will happen. If you don't fix this, this is the next stage that we will have to act upon. That's open and transparent and honest. Inappropriate humour is something I always have to be very careful of. Sometimes I might try and say something that is lightly humorous to try and soften the mood. It always lands badly. Don't do it. And number 10, surely we should ask questions when we give feedback. Well, we should. Of course, questions are nice. They're more inclusive. But if you don't know the answer, there's no point me saying, so how do you think you've done? And you go, brilliant. Oh my goodness, I've been great. Because I've then got to say, not quite what I've got on the KPIs here. So questions are good, but sometimes we just need to tell people and give them the feedback. So I've got 2 lovely, simple, to-the-point models you can use when you do need to give feedback. The first one here is called E2C2, which sounds a little bit like a robot in a mythical science fiction movie, doesn't it? So it's an odd name, by the way, because it doesn't quite work out as 2s either, but let me explain. The idea is, anytime you need to give somebody a short piece of feedback, you're going to use E2C2. What was the evidence? So remember, we said we're not going to be vague on the previous slide. What's the evidence? What's the thing you want to talk about? Hello, colleague, this is the thing I'm going to refer to. So E2C2 is perfect when you've got those individual points you need to raise. You're then going to give it's plus there, the effect. This is the evidence. This is what you did or didn't do. This was the effect. This is what it caused. Now, you want these to be specific and objective. So we are clear. Objective means it is provable. Subjective means it is your opinion. You are going to focus on the world of objective. You did this, it caused this. Not, you did this, and I think so-and-so was angry too. That is your opinion. So you're only going to keep to what you know. So you're not going to say you did this, and you were obviously trying to make a point. Because you don't know they were trying to make a point. That is your opinion. You did this, it caused this. Evidence and effect. Now, if they're doing something then that you don't want them to do anymore, you're going to go into change and consequence. So that is our E2, C2. So you did this, it caused this, evidence, effect, change. This is what I want you to do next time. This is what I want you to do instead. When you find yourself in this position, I'd like you to consider these steps instead. Consequence is important. If you don't, remember what we said about implied threat on the last slide. If you don't do that, this will happen. If you're unable to accept that as an idea, this will be the next process. Now, the word consequence is interesting. It's a little bit of a triggering word, so I would gently advise you, be very mindful of not actually saying the word consequence, because that really winds people up. Instead, allude to the effects of, if they don't do what you've asked for in the change. This is what happens next. So for me, it looks a little bit like, this is the evidence. You did this. This is the effect. It caused this. This is the change I want you to make. So do this next time, please. If you do this, I would put both a positive and a you don't want to hear it bit. If you do this, this will happen. If you don't do this, this will happen. In other words, I'm not implying something bad will happen. I am telling you clearly and upfront. I'm not ladling that with all sorts of, oh, bad things will happen. I'm just telling you. I'm telling you the consequence, but I'm trying to avoid using the word consequence. If you use the word consequence, that's fine, by the way. Let's not get hung up on this. But it tends to be a little bit of a triggering word. It's there because it just works quite well for E2C2. So that's if you've got something you want them to do differently. So if it's something they've not done well, you could use the other C that is there, continue, in which case it becomes, I suppose, technically E2C1, but never mind. This was the evidence. You did this. This was the effect. It caused this. Please keep doing this because, oh my goodness, good stuff, good stuff, good stuff. Now, this means you can use E2C2 for both positive and developmental feedback. And the value of that is it gives you a really good chance to develop and improve your abilities when having these conversations and actually avoiding the difficult part, the bit when you fall out, the bit when you get upset. One of the great things about E2C2, it is very well known. So if you've not heard of it before, you can find it all over, whatever your favourite social media platform is, or indeed whatever your favourite search engine is, and you'll be able to find videos, papers, graphics, images, and all sorts. Alternatively, use what's on the screen right now, and that will help you when you next have to give a short to the point piece of feedback. The other model that I want to share with you is the Performance 5-Point Plan. And this is ideal where you've got to help somebody manage something over a period of time. So whereas E2C2 is do this differently next time, Performance 5-Point Plan is one of those, listen, we need to fix this over the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. It's one of those sorts of problems. And it's very respectful, it's very effective, and it just works. Let me walk you through the way that I would propose you think about using it. The first thing is this. Don't tell them it's called a Performance 5-Point Plan. If you do that, that will worry them. They'll think I'm on some kind of personal performance in process or some formal structure within the organisation. So it's called a Performance 5-Point Plan, so you and I know what it's called, but don't tell your colleague. Two ways you can use this. You can either tell them you're doing this plan, as in, I've got 5 stages I'm going to go through, show them the questions and the points, or don't show them, keep the notes to one side so that they'll guide you in the conversation and try and make it feel a bit more natural. Both of them work very well. My personal preference is to tell them I'm going to work through these 5 areas because it separates me and them from the issue. So remember we said earlier on, people sometimes conflate the individual with the behaviour. So we said on this list here, the feedback judges individuals, not actions. So what I like about this is if I say to them, I'm going to follow these 5 steps, it separates them from the behaviour and the outcome. So first of all, the problem. Let's agree what the problem is. Now, ideally, if I'm the manager or supervisor, you're going to tell me what the problem is. It might be that you don't know, in which case I will have to tell you. It might be that you don't want to get involved, in which case I'm going to have to tell you. Or it might be that we are colleagues or equals or peers, in which case we might decide to talk together about the problem. And what we're aiming to get is an agreed, ideally, little sentence, couple of sentences. We don't want to have to explain it every time with reams and reams of detail and stories. Instead, it's just, this is the problem. And your preference here is to write it down so that when you say to them, this is the problem, you read out the sentence, they go, yes, that's the problem. Great. What do we want instead? Now, much the same as problem, ideally, we want them to go, yes, that's the solution. So far, the first 2 parts, this is the problem, yes, this is the solution, yes. Now we want to agree with them how long they have to fix this problem. The problem we've agreed with the solution we've agreed. Now, many times people say, well, just do it immediately, do it ASAP. Let's catch up in a couple of weeks and assume it's all done. Those things aren't precise enough. And the reason that often we do that is because we think, well, we've got through it okay, don't want to make this any worse than it has to be, let's just agree 4 weeks, we'll catch up then. So instead, what I want to be able to do is to go, right, what's the date today? Okay, so it is this date next month or whatever it's going to be. So we agree that date. So what we're agreeing at this stage on how long is the problem is we've agreed, the solution we've agreed, and we have agreed, you and I, that that solution will be up and running completely and fully by this date. Now, when we get to support, the question that is often asked is, do you need any help from me? And that question is nearly always answered with, no, I'm fine. And the reason it's answered with, no, I'm fine, is because if we're having a conversation where I'm in trouble, effectively, I don't want this conversation to last any longer than it has to. So I'm far more likely to go, yeah, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. I know what I'm doing. No, I'm fine. So instead, the question you should be asking is, what support do you need from me? Now, they will still you nearly always go, I'm fine. At which point you say, that's great. Let's catch up. Let's say it's a month you've given them. Let's catch up in 2 weeks just to make sure everything's okay. Just for 5 minutes, a quick milestone meeting. So if they say, I do want support, you say, great, what support do you need? And they'll say, well, I'll make sure I'm on the right track. You say, great, let's meet up in 2 weeks. If they say, I do not need support, you say, great, let's meet up in 2 weeks. Either way, if you don't put in a little milestone meeting, what will happen 4 weeks from now is they won't have done this because they'll have forgotten. Life is busy, you'll forget, meetings get put back. The second question I always ask on support is this. What's the first thing you're going to do after this meeting? Now, their answer should be, do you know what? Oh my goodness, I'm so glad you raised this. I'm going to go and see Bob and apologise. I'm going to go and check myself into that programme and see if I can start to learn a bit more. In other words, they should have some ideas about what they're going to do. If their response is, well, they haven't really been listening. So you need to just go back over problem solution and how long in order to ensure they're really bought in and clear to this. So what's the first thing you're going to do as a result of this meeting? And then finally, what next? And what next is exactly what we just spoke about with consequence. What next is this? Problem, solution, this timeline. We've talked about support, what you're going to do first. 4 weeks from now, you will be fine. Everything will be great. We're all sorted. Equally, colleague, if you don't do these steps, if we don't get on top of this, if we don't fix this, we will be here. And if we are here, colleague, the next thing that will happen will be this. You'll notice that's not an implied threat. It's an upfront, open, honest, transparent, professional delivery. I'd like us to be here. If we're here, this is what happens next. And that's pretty much this program, all about difficult conversations, courageous conversations, or indeed just conversations. You can, if you want to catch up with me, if you want to see a little bit more about what I do and where I do it, these are 3 very popular platforms you can find me on. So YouTube there or LinkedIn, you'll notice my name is Graham David and then the number 1 on both of those. Or if you're a little bit more out there and you like slightly more interesting, engaging, dangerous stuff, get yourself onto TikTok, where you'll find me as Graham David. And down the bottom of the screen, you can see a range of the sorts of topics. These are the most popular topics we get asked about. They're not the only topics, but these are the ones that we are most frequently asked about that we are able to help you with. So hopefully you've enjoyed this program. If you have, feel free to check me out on any of those platforms. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.